moving into chapter 7 of the book of Esther. And we wound up chapter 6, the wonderful coming together of so many providences that God had set up in the life of Mordecai and Esther, working through a myriad of ways. We had the little graphic last week with all the lines that converged and really into chapter 7, but chapter 6, chapter 7, really chapter 8, all these chapters just kind of flow right into each other. And as we've emphasized all the way through, many times we don't see the very small events that happen in our lives. We just see them, experience them, move through them, and go on. And all of a sudden, one day, maybe down the road, they all come together, and we see a providence that God has placed to guide, direct, help, deliver, whatever the case might be. And we wrapped up by talking about Haman last week, and that, Haman had to honor Mordecai, the man that he wanted that morning to come and talk to the king about hanging on his gallows. Instead, he ended up having to honor this man as someone very great in the kingdom. And he was very much ashamed by that. But as we noted, he really didn't have time to plot what to do, because in verse 14 of chapter 6, while they were still talking with him, this is his advisors / friends, his wife, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So we pick up in chapter 7, verse 1, New International Version, of course. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. Now, it's really, to me, and I've noted this several times, that it's almost amusing as you read through this section. You can't help but think that this trip to the second banquet on the second day wasn't nearly as joyous to Haman as he had originally planned. Remember, he had originally planned to have Mordecai dead by now, and he would just come, hip-hopping into the banquet with the king and with Esther. But things had really changed. And this banquet, he wasn't entering in nearly as comfortable or as happy as he wanted to be. He really has no idea what's about to fall on him. And as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king asked asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Now, evidently the meal that Esther had planned was finished. Well, commentators note that serving wine was customarily served after the meal. So the banquet itself really was no big deal. Haman came, Esther served them the banquet, and now the eating was over. They were doing as was their custom, as was their culture. They were drinking wine. And the king asked again, what does she desire? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, I will give it to you. And just reading this, I noted it as I was studying on it and read it this second time he's mentioning this, or third time really, or second time. You just kind of get the sense that this time the request was given with a greater sense of interest and a little more direction. Remember, Esther had come to the king against the law and had asked him to come to a banquet. Then, at that banquet, he says, what's your request? She said, come tomorrow to another banquet, and I'll tell you. So, evidently, this had been weighing on the mind of the king, and this second request by the king to, what is it that you need? What is it that you want? Really was driven by a greater interest, a greater concern on his part. And again, the Holy Spirit knows how to use timing to our advantage. Obviously, the king was thinking of material goods, position, or some other, surface type thing. He said even up to half the kingdom. But Esther had something totally different on her mind. Now, let's look at how she approached this. Verse 3, Then Queen Esther answered, If I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. Now, Esther really is working in this revealing of her petition. Now let's look at what she does. She opens with calm, and she opens with submission. We'll see in chapter 7, verse 8, she never even got off the couch. When they were reclining, as they would do, as they did that same thing even in Jesus' day. So this was a custom that just they did for thousands of years. Around the table, they'd have their food and they would recline back. And the king is asking her, what do you want? Now, if you were asking for your life, if you were seeking the deliverance of the whole nation of people, calm wouldn't necessarily be one of the first words that would, characterize that discussion. That's what I'm talking about. See, she agreed. But Esther had a sense of calmness and a sense of submission, because as she starts, she says, If I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty. She's calm. She is in a state of submission. And that really would take nerves of steel. I don't think, at least me, I don't think I would be anywhere near this calm in the presence of the man that by just a whim could have you destroyed and has already signed a law that cannot be revoked, that all your people are going to be killed. I don't know that I could be just, calm. What is your request, Esther? Well, what I really want is this. Still reclining on the couch. That's where the king found Haman when he came back into the room. That's nerves or steel, or it is rest in faith. I prefer to think that Esther was resting in faith. We would, in today, would be nervous, we'd be upset. We would want to confront, we would want, to face the king because we have the moral high ground. But Esther remembered, this is where the submission comes in, that this is an unstable king. It doesn't take too much to turn his bucket over. It doesn't take too much to irritate him. And he's the king of an empire. So even though she had the moral high ground, she has faith, she has all this, she is not stupid. So she appeals in a submissive way, calm way, resting in faith, but she's being wise at the same time. And it's interesting as she reveals this, that she works from what is most obvious, which is herself, and then moves to the larger issue of her people. She says, If I have found favor, O king, if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. Now, was she hedging her bets? Well, if you can't save them all, at least save me. Was she hedging her bets for herself and then talking about her people? What do you think? Was she being selfish? in starting from that point.
Well, he cared more for her than he did people he didn't know, so she wasn't being selfish. She
Right.
appealed to what he loved more.
Yeah. She started, I'm sorry.
She's been shrewd, I think. When you touch the pieces and applying that principle here.
Be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. And I think she was. I think it was, instead of being selfish, she was being shrewd, and she was playing off what was, this is as good as my handwriting gets, so if you can't read it, just ask the translation. These folks already understand this, so, but just saying. Played off what was emotionally important to the king. Yeah, she was being shrewd. He knew that she had favor with him. He knew also that it could fall apart in just a minute because of his being so unstable in some of his thinking. But starting with herself, and she knew that the king held her in great favor, it was a strategy to center his attention and maybe possibly throw him off balance so that she could then argue the point. I want my life, king. Like, bam, who's going to try to take the life of my queen? And in that state, then go in and say, and my people. So she was being very shrewd. Esther, as beautiful a story as this book is, Esther is a smart woman. She is a wise woman. And she may have also taken this approach to kind of take Haman out of the picture. He didn't know, remember, that she was a Jew, like Mordecai and all the rest. Haman didn't know this, another providence that was in play here. So when she is saying to the king, I want you to save my life, Haman has no clue. He would be right in that, well, who in the world, blah, blah, blah. Because he doesn't know that Esther is a Jew, just like Mordecai is a Jew. And she finally finished her request with a loophole, if you will. Look at what she says in verse 4. For I and my people have been sold for destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. If we had merely, look at that, working it. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. And this is the loophole that she works in. She says, if I had been sold as a slave, I wouldn't have even bothered you, Your Majesty. Now, commentators note that the last part of this verse, if you have a King James or a different translation, commentators note that this last phrase has been difficult to translate. Some translations talk about the death of Xerxes' Jewish subjects would be a more grievous loss to him than enslavement would be to the Jews. Or, as the New International Version has here, the selling of Jews as slaves was not sufficient grounds to trouble the king. And the second, which the NIV gives, is on balance preferred by most of the commentators that you'll read to what is in the King James Version. But King James it's not a bad translation, it's just one of several, because the Hebrew in that is a little difficult to really pin down. So we have a threefold approach that she used. She was respectful, then showing the hurt personally to the king by her being at risk, and then the larger hurt by the declaration of the destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. Instead of slavery, was much wiser than simply blurting out to him or arguing with him over the killing of the Jews because it was wrong. And out of this, one of the things that stands out to us, it's much easier to talk with someone from the standpoint of how a plan will not benefit them personally and or their things versus just pointing out the wrong of their plans. So how many of you have had conversations where you work this? You know, maybe you had it on your job. Maybe you used it with your kids. Maybe you've used it on each other as spouses. I don't know. But instead of just coming out and saying, that whole thing is just nuts, how in the world could you think of doing something like that? To work it by seeing how there's personal hurt. It's going to cost you. It's really, you're not going to benefit. All of these things to get to the same point of this plan is bad. It's a wise way of dealing with difficult conversations, difficult people. I've got part of my work and what I'm doing. I'm crafting several modules of training for a school system in another part of the state to help them communicate with parents. Am I going to use something like this? Yeah. Not just, for school folks to realize you can't just tell a parent, well, you got to help your kid do their homework. I'm glad I don't have to help my grandyoungers with their homework. I wouldn't have a clue. Because, the last time I was in school, which was 100 years ago, things are different. And, you want to help parents to understand. And that's where I'm going to be talking with their administrators, their superintendents, their principals, and all this other stuff for that. But it's one of those elements that if you're going to point out the wrong, don't just point out how stupid it is. Reason it out. Help that person to see that it's to their benefit to recognize the error, of the plan, whatever it might be. Whether you're talking with your youngins about going out on Saturday night, or whether you're talking with your spouse about buying this or that property, that house, that car, whatever it might be, or whatever it is. Take that reasoned approach, calm, submission, don't be stupid, be shrewd, play off what is emotionally important, just work that thing across. Can be very helpful. So, verse 5. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing?" She layered, and this is another element that shows in all of this, Esther layered emotion upon emotion as she laid this out to the king. By the time she was done with her short petition, remember she laid on the couch, she laid back on her elbow probably, talking with the king. There's earnestness, there is emotion, there is passion in her voice, but she's still calm, she's still submitted because she's resting in faith. She has layered this to the point that by the time she finishes this little short conversation, just 2 verses, the king is boiling. Who has dared to do such a thing? The Hebrew for that phrase is, who is to fill his heart to do this. The king realized that whatever she was talking about was not just a mistake, it wasn't a simple error. Someone had given thought, and there was desire in this plan for his, Xerxes, hurt. Now, that he was concerned about Esther was one way, but it's still all about him. That's just how he was. But by the time she had finished that, he was just steamed. And you can't help but wonder if Haman had begun to realize what's going on. Esther's words, destruction and slaughter and annihilation, were his words in intent in the decree that he wrote out back in chapter 3, verse 13. Look at verse 6. Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." Bam. However, when she drops the bomb, if he didn't have a clue, he was seized with terror. This is the rest of that verse. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. That word, was terrified, is that he was seized. It just kind of fell on him. It's almost like he was in pitch black dark, and then a moment later, a huge bright light. I mean, he's just taken over by this, just overwhelmed by it. It struck him like a bolt. He now realizes that it's not just Mordecai that he's got a problem with in his plan, who has just, been honored for saving the king's life. Now it's the very favorite queen of the king that he has offended. You can almost, in reading this, you can almost see Haman just looking from one to the other. He doesn't know who to appeal to at this point. It's just blown him away. And he's realized that he has no friend in this room now. He's offended the queen. He's made the king mad. He is by himself. The king got up in a rage. See, he was boiling. Left his wine and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, he figured, okay, it's over. He is mad at me, and I know how he gets when he gets mad. I am cooked. I am done. He realized the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Now, the fury, the anger of the king is described in his leaving the room, and it's just interesting that the Holy Spirit had the writer include "and his wine." When you get up and you leave your liquor, you're upset, and for that type of person. Evidently, that meant a lot to the king to be that much involved. We've seen liquor all the way through, wine, drunkenness all the way through this book, and how it had affected the king. The king now sees his dilemma and what had happened. What do you think upset the king, as well as the fact of all of this? What else? Now that Esther has revealed that it's Haman's plan that has caused this, what else enters his mind?
He knows he can't change it
Why can't he?
because he signed it. He
He
knows that he
signed
signed it. Yeah. So he's got to be thinking, what can I do?
In realizing that it was Haman's plan, it was the king's signet ring that sealed it. The king realized he had signed it, and the law of the Persians, once the king had offered it, he's going to talk about this later on, and had signed something, you can't change that law. He's the one who condemned his queen. He's the one who has condemned her people. So not only is he angry because Haman is attacking or going to attack his queen, he's angry because he was duped into agreeing. He's been duped by his own foolishness. And remember, he never asked Haman who the people were. He never, when Haman laid out the plan, there is a people who are living in your empire. They don't follow your laws. They don't do what you want them to do. And I think we ought to kill all of them. Well, just go ahead and do whatever you want to do with them, Haman. He didn't ask a single follow-up question. He just agreed. And now he realizes his foolishness. How many times in our lives have we signed something or we agreed to something only to recognize later on, boy, was I suckered into that. I was suckered into that because I didn't ask further questions. I just accepted it at face value. I didn't, you know.
I think that's coming back to the debate of people in general, right? How many times have you gone in a work situation, or in a family situation, defend somebody and say they're not doing this or whatever, and you turn around and they're doing it. It's like, wait a minute, you know what happened here, right?
Yeah.
So that's just what happened to him. He put his faith in people
Yeah.
and in his own arrogance, and then he's like, you know, I chose them, they've got to be good, so it's got to be right. So everything that he's built upon and decided on.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent point with that. You know, he's been duped into this, but duped by his own volition. And seldom do we get as angry as when we realize that we fell for it. Whatever it is. You know, in most cases it's not genocide, you know. But there's been times in all of our lives when something was pulled over us. And because we trusted or we just thought we knew the facts and we refused to really think about it, take the time, you know, like some salesmen do, you need to do this today, you know, it won't be here tomorrow if you know. And we go ahead and then after that we realize, boy, was that stupid.
Who, just out of curiosity, as a king, who is their God? Who are they worshiping?
They were polytheistic, they were pagan. They had a multiplicity of gods in the Persian Empire. And probably some of the Babylonian gods, Marduk would be one of their chief gods. And one of the things about the Persian Empire is that they allowed for a freedom of religion, if you will. You know, that they didn't just demand, like Babylon, like Nebuchadnezzar said to the people, that you only worship me. You know, so they allowed for a polytheistic setup. So they had many, you know, different gods.
The reason I asked, I wonder if it's, you know, when you're talking about these seals, faith of people, when he made that decision, because it doesn't say he meditated on any way, he just went with it, he just said, go for it.
Just what
So he did it on his own. It wasn't that he went to a higher power or prayed or meditated.
He consulted with himself, basically. And said, well, this sounds like a good deal. Yeah, it does. Think I ought to do it? Yeah, I think you ought to. And he did. And now he's hung. Yeah, his own arrogance did that. So Xerxes may have needed a minute, you know. When he got up and left the room, he may have needed a minute to consider his options. Because all of this is now just flooding in on him, of his own element of complicity in this. One option seems to be pretty well fixed. Haman already now knows that, you know, his fate's sealed. But it's interesting that instead of following the king, now you would think Haman, you know, should have followed the king and said something, but instead he stays to beg Esther for his life. And the irony is just simply too much to ignore. Now remember, Haman had planned to have the Jews grovel for their lives. And he looked forward to denying them their life. He looked forward to that. But now, instead of that happening, he is groveling at the feet of a Jew. How ironic. What you expected to happen didn't happen. What you did not expect to happen did. But it has always been so. And it always will be for the Jewish people. They are God's people, and God will, because He has chosen them. For no other reason than the fact that He has chosen them, will always be there for the Jewish people. They are his people. Satan still thinks, even today, that he can destroy the Jews, and he will decidedly seek to do that in the tribulation period. But God will intervene even then. And at that time, he will personally intervene to destroy those plans. I want to read a passage to you. This is Zechariah chapter 14. And this is a prophecy regarding the Battle of Armageddon, the end of the tribulation period. A day of the Lord is coming when your plunder will be divided among you. I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. The city will be captured, the houses ransacked, and the women raped. Half of the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be taken from the city. Now this is not the battle of Gog and Magog. Remember that battle the Jews win decidedly. This is Antichrist turning on the Jews, and the final battle, the Battle of Armageddon, that takes place. And it is going very badly for the Jews at that point. Verse 3. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley, with half of the mountain moving north and half moving south. You will flee by my mountain valley, for it will extend to Azel. You will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. That's us. That's us. On that day, there will be no light, no cold or frost. It will be a unique day, without daytime or nighttime, a day known to the Lord. When evening comes, there will be light. On that day, living water will flow out of Jerusalem, half to the eastern sea, half to the western sea, in summer and in winter. The whole land, the Lord will be king over the whole earth. On that day there will be one Lord, and his name the only name. The whole land from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem, will become like the Arabah. But Jerusalem will be raised up and remain in its place, from the Benjamin gate to the site of the first gate, to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the royal wine presses. It will be in, here it is, here's the verse, right? I read all that to get to this. It will be inhabited. Never again will it be destroyed. Jerusalem will be secured. Esther is just another example of the commitment of God to his people, the Jews. And try as Satan might try. And he's tried all through history. Hitler made a pretty good run at it himself. But who ended up being defeated, and who is the populous people now? The Jews. And even after the millennial reign of Christ, Revelation chapter 20, verses 7 through 15, even after that 1,000 years where he is reigning on earth, the carnality of humanity will be deceived again. But that battle will wrap it all up. The results of that will be Satan and all of his work that he has been doing for eons stopped and destroyed. I mean, Esther is just another example of the greatness of what God is doing and will continue to do. And I think it's just important for us, whether as a nation, as a people, as an individual, to realize this doesn't excuse the Jews from anything they're doing that is not right, but at the same time to recognize these are God's people. And we have to approach them with that understanding in mind. Now, What was on the king's mind as he came back into the room? Look at verse 8. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. See, remember, she's reclining on the couch. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Hang him on it." Appreciate you saving me a little time. Ma'am?
You thought about that for a while.
Yeah, they didn't take him long. Yeah, this is a man who acts on whim. You know, he acts on whim. Esther is smart coming in. You know, smart woman with that. Hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Now, you know, what was on the king's mind as he comes back into the room? You know, we're never told. Maybe he had a plan. Maybe he had a verdict on Haman. Maybe he had thought of a way to spare Esther. We don't know what that is. But Haman is coming apart at the seams, man. He's losing all sense of how to help his situation. As one commentator notes, Haman's timing couldn't be worse. But the Holy Spirit knows how to manage evil's timing as well as his own. That's one of the great things that stands out about this passage. The Holy Spirit has timing down to the most exact science. You know, just a coming together right at the right time. Perfect time for the king to see Haman. Worst time in the world for Haman to be seen by the king. But the Holy Spirit can work that timing out. Haman has broken all custom and decorum in how to approach one of the king's harem women, much less the favored queen. He's fallen down, you know, maybe he had grabbed her feet, I don't know. But he was going to beg for his life. He didn't have anything else in mind. But the king sees this, and just as his nature is, he jumps to conclusion. Haman is begging, but it looks like to the king, he's touching the queen. Whether this in his mind was sexual in nature or domination, didn't make any difference. You don't touch the king's women. Stupid. And you can't fix stupid. You can hang it on the gallows. You got hung, but you can't fix stupid. And Haman's taken by the king's guards. And as he's taken, one of the king's eunuchs tells the king of Haman's gallows, where he wanted to hang Mordecai. And it's interesting that the haughtiness and the vanity of Haman didn't bring any real friends to him. He was a man. He had it all going for him. I mean, he was wealthy. He was powerful. He wore the king's signet ring. I mean, he spoke in the name of the king. But it's interesting just how when people get to a position of power, how they allow their own vanity, their own arrogance, and their own pride to then just try to step on everybody else that they perceive is lower than them. And as they do this, instead of having friends, Harbona probably bowed before Haman. He probably trembled in his sight. He stood in his presence. All these things that Haman wanted. But he was just waiting for an opportunity to bring him down. And I think it's good for us. We're not a Haman, no. But there are times when, we get a little proud of ourselves. We get a little confident in ourselves. We get a little, we get above our raisins, as one of the phrases go. And we think we are somebody. And when we start acting like that, rest assured that somebody's waiting. Just waiting for the opportunity to take you down.
So you're saying that
Yes, sir. He was abusing his power. He wanted everybody to know he was somebody. So even when people acknowledge that we are somebody, always pays to kind of watch that. Whether they are true friends or whether they're just looking for a chance. The old saying is, be careful of the knife that butters you up, because it will stab you in the back. I don't know who first told me that, but I've heard that all my life. It's true. It's very true. Harboni. Just waited. You can't help but think he may have had a little smirk on his face when he said that to the king. Haman was hanged on his own gallows. I imagine Harboni was glad that Haman was still in the room. His head had been covered. They covered his face. He's got a gallows. And it just made Harboni's day, evidently, to bring this man down. Questions? Points? I got just a few minutes, so we're going to just kind of move into chapter 8. Won't get very far into this, but I'm going to give you a teaser, as I often do, about where we're going to go next week in chapter 8. Even though the beginning of chapter 8 is continuing to relate events that were occurring on the same day as Esther's banquet. Chapter 8 is really starting off with the same day as chapter 7. Chapter 8 moves us to another division of the book. Now, I've entitled this division that goes from chapter 8, verse 1 through chapter 9, verse 18. I've entitled this, Revenge. For the purpose of Esther's approach to the king was so that, and this is her second approach, this is her in chapter 8, what she's going to talk about, was so that the Jews would be ready to avenge themselves on their enemies. Chapter 8, verse 14. And this is going to open a discussion for us that relates to the Jewish mindset today. And it provides us as believers an opportunity to discuss where Christians stand on the point of vengeance or revenge. We're going to talk about that. Is it Christian to take revenge? Is it a Christian quality to have vengeance? Jews had it here. Where do we stand on this? And we'll get into that discussion next week, and we'll talk about that. It will be interesting, I am sure. So, how about that? I'm wrapping up right on time. I might get a gold star and a blue ribbon for that. I don't know.
Billy, do we assume that Haman's family was killed?
Yeah, we're going to read.
Also.
Yeah, we're going to read that part of what Esther asked for later on in chapter 9. The king is saying, Esther, the Jews have just put it on their enemies. What else do you want? She said, I want his sons killed. So
Okay.
all 10 of his sons are killed. We don't know what happened to his wife. That's not recorded here. So, but obviously she went from being high society to needing food stamps right quick. I mean, she was destitute in just a blink.
We assumed at that time it wouldn't matter if she survived, not if women were what they was looked upon. Men would have the opportunity to rise, so she got rid of all the men. There's no
Right. She was, whoever wanted her could have her after that. Yeah. She had nothing to stand on after that. Good question, though. All right. Other questions? Other points? Grab some coffee. Grab you some cider. You got a little time to talk if you're on fellowship. Thanks to my relatives for being here today.